Keith Brown, and this is a public policy podcast.
Well, I haven't given up on my real goals. I think this is a dramatic step forward. Normally in the history of civil rights advancements, presidents have not necessarily been in the forefront in the beginning. And so I think the fact that we actually have the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreeing that it's time to take this question off the enlistment form, that there ought to be a serious examination of how this would be done, even though they haven't agreed that it should be done, that the Senate, if they vote for the motion advocated by Senators Nunn and Mitchell, will agree. Senators who don't agree that the policy should be changed are agreeing that we ought to have a chance to work through this for 6 months and persuade them of that, I think is very, very significant. Now, I would remind you that any president's executive order can be overturned by an act of Congress. The president can then veto the act of Congress and try to have his veto sustained if the act stands on its own as a simple issue that could always be vetoed. But I always knew that there was a chance that the Congress would disagree with my position. I can only tell you that I still think I'm right. I feel comfortable about the way we have done this, and I'm going to maintain the commitment that I have.
The newly elected President of the United States in 1993, President Bill Clinton was explaining how he was going to change military policy on the open service of gay officers. As you could hear, despite having been just elected to the most powerful position in the world, he struggles to explain the minutiae of the policy change, how Congress could ultimately overturn the policy, yet how he might then use a presidential veto. This is a constrained presidency, not a bold office with unlimited policy powers. How presidents make public policy is often confused by an expansive image of the presidency that does not conform to what Bill Clinton just demonstrated. Instead, presidents use a variety of policy tools, often based on elaborate strategies rather than bold action. Listen to Professor William Howell describe the two views of the presidency.
So there are two facts, and they stand at odds with one another. The first is that we have these outsized expectations of our president. It's hard to think of any domain where the president is given a pass, where you can say that's above my pay grade or that's somebody else's job. The president, on everything from Midwestern droughts to school shootings to warming climates to security threats in every part of the region of the globe, is meant to not just have a position, but to be out in front, identifying what the problems are and what ought to be done about them. And this is a fact of the modern presidency in particular, but it speaks to what the core incentives are that presidents have, right? How are they possibly going to meet these expectations and thereby placate today's public and tomorrow's historians, which strike me as the two most relevant audiences for the presidency.
But there's also the other view, perhaps the right view of a more limited presidency. Listen to Howell again.
On the other hand, if you read Article 2 and you look for explicit delegations of authority that allow presidents to meet these extraordinary expectations, you're going to be hard-pressed to find them. They're pretty slim pickings in Article 2, and what's offered and where presidents have found sort of a basis for building a constitutional argument for vast authority is by reading deeply into a handful of what are, by most accounts, really vague delegations of authority about, the take care clause or given the executive power. It's not clear what the executive power is. But you've got to sort of read deeply in there to have a chance.
Given these two different views of the public policy dimensions of the presidency, we might look to the different areas that presidents try to act. One of the least ambiguous areas of presidential power over policy is in the area of war and peace. Here's President George Bush announcing the war with Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Presidents have explicit and near unilateral authority within the Constitution to oversee the military, but committing the nation to war still requires congressional approval. Even where presidential policy authority is highest, there are still limitations. So within these constitutional parameters, presidents attempt to make public policy. One way that they do this is to refer to electoral mandates that, they claim, show that the American people wanted them to make policy. Professor Julia Azari describes the different types of mandates that presidents claim.
Anytime the president uses the election or the campaign to justify what they're doing, they can either talk about the magnitude of the election. So one way to talk about a mandate, and this is usually the way that I think creeps into journalistic language after an election has just occurred, is kind of, what would be an exceptional enough result to constitute a mandate. So they talk about, sometimes in the journalistic conversation and other literature, they'll talk about, well, it was a surprise, or it was a majority, or it was a big majority, which gets very fuzzy very fast. Like what kind of numbers justify an exceptional election result?
I have noted in listening to the returns a few minutes ago that several commentators have reflected on the fact that this may be one of the great political victories of all time. In terms of votes, that may be true. But in terms of what a victory really is, a huge landslide margin means nothing at all unless it is a victory for America. It will be a victory for America only if in these next 4 years we, all of us, can work together to achieve our common great goals of peace at home and peace for all nations in the world, and for that new progress and prosperity which all Americans deserve.
So that's one definition. Another definition, which reaches further back into American history, and a lot of people attribute to Andrew Jackson. The president has a unique relationship with the people, and the members of Congress represent their districts or their states, what have you, but only the president is elected by the whole people, and so by virtue of that, the president is kind of this unique representative of the whole people. And then finally, the one that I find is most common in the 20th century, and especially in the early 21st century, is this more almost European concept of a responsible party mandate. I said I would do this, I campaigned on it, people voted for me, and now I'm going to do it. And so that gets you out of some of these other problems.
How do you do? I have a brief opening statement here before I take your questions. Yesterday, Secretary of the Treasury Donald Regan sent to the Congress a request to raise the debt ceiling to $985 billion. This represents a dramatic jump of $50 billion over the previous debt ceiling. The administration took this action with great regret because it's clear that the massive deficits our government runs is one of the root causes of our profound economic problems. And for too many years, this process has come too easily for us. We've lived beyond our means and then financed our extravagance on the backs of the American people. The clear message I received in the election campaign is that we must gain control of this inflationary monster.
An electoral mandate is one way to justify policy, but not that only way. Presidents have also looked to public opinion polling to measure the attitudes of the American public, shape strategies to influence public opinion, all with an eye to advancing a policy agenda. Listen to Professor Lawrence Jacobs describe the use of presidential polling.
One of the key themes that we focus on is how presidents use polling and then their political strategies to create discretion. That is, for presidents to do what they want to do. They come in, they've got an agenda, and the kind of ideal of democracy is, well, presidents are going to follow what the country wants. This is not the case. Presidents come into office already committed to policies, and that's what they're going to do. They turn to polling to figure out how to do that in a way that will allow them and their supporters to survive electoral punishment.
Claiming a mandate or relying on polling may allow a president the legitimacy of public opinion to pursue a policy, but not a method of how to do so. Presidents then must turn to several policy tools, including appointment powers, budgetary powers, and the power to work with Congress. For example, one of the ways that a president, especially a newly elected one, may do so is through appointing members of the cabinet, and especially policy advisors, sometimes called White House czars. So-called policy czars are given the power to oversee the development of new policy ideas. Professor Justin Vaughn describes how President Richard Nixon used an energy czar in the 1960s to push an energy policy agenda.
And so after a while, Nixon grows frustrated with Love's preferred approaches to solving this problem, and he recruits somebody from a different part of his administration to come over and kind of take Love's job, right? And that's Bill Simon. Simon basically becomes the new energy czar, and Simon has a totally different relationship with Nixon, right? Nixon respects him. He appreciates his perspectives, and Nixon even takes Simon to a cabinet meeting and introduces him, and basically makes it clear that Bill Simon has his ear, that when it comes to energy, what Bill Simon says goes, and that President Nixon is going to support him, right? Sending a very clear signal to the other people in this kind of fragmented bureaucracy that when Bill Simon speaks on energy, he's speaking with the voice of the president. And in doing so, Nixon empowers him tremendously. And so Simon starts to make pretty, radical decisions, some of which, had history played out, may have been terrible decisions, right? There was a decision towards the end of the energy crisis to flood the market with available oil, even though a very cold winter was projected. And had the embargo not ended when it did, the United States would have been well short of necessary stocks of home heating oil. But it did end. And so instead of being, the precursor to a tragic winter, it was a brilliant move that brought the price of oil down, and we didn't have to worry about the consequences, because by the time we would have run out of oil, the embargo had ended and oil was freely flowing again. So because Simon had this close relationship with the president, because the president backed him up and authorized him to take bold action, he was able to be a very effective czar.
George Bush followed this same strategy in the 2000s when he attempted to pursue a policy that relied upon faith-based organizations to carry out federal policy. He created an Office of Faith-Based Initiatives and a policy czar to lead the policy work. Listen to him describe this.
Today, I want to raise the priority and profile of these issues within my own administration. I want to ensure that faith-based and community groups will always have a place at the table in our deliberations. In a few moments, I will sign 2 executive orders. The first executive order will create a new office called the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. The head of this office will report directly to me and be charged with important responsibilities. He will oversee our initiatives on this issue. He will make sure our government, where it works with private groups, is fair and supportive. And he will highlight groups as national models so others can learn from them.
Czars can carry out the policy wishes of the president and in doing so, execute a more ambitious policy agenda. In other cases, the president must work with Congress to make policy. Presidents can recommend a budget or specific policies to Congress, which then has the authority to write and pass the legislation needed to make the law. Listen here to President Barack Obama try to convince Congress that a new health care policy was needed.
Now is the time to deliver on health care. The plan I'm announcing tonight would meet three basic goals. It will provide more security and stability to those who have health insurance. It will provide insurance for those who don't. And it will slow the growth of healthcare costs for our families, our businesses, and our government. It's a plan that asks everyone to take responsibility for meeting this challenge. Not just government, not just insurance companies, but everybody, including employers and individuals. And it's a plan that incorporates ideas from senators and congressmen, from Democrats and Republicans, and yes, from some of my opponents in both the primary and general election.
The president ultimately won this battle, and Obamacare was later enacted as law, even if future presidents did not remain as convinced that this was wise presidential policymaking. Therefore, to understand policy in the presidency, we have to first understand the constraints around the president. The Constitution gives the president few unilateral tools to make policy. Second, instead, the president must use the authority given by the Constitution, such as related to issues of war and peace, along with other policy tools, including budget policy, legislative policy, and policy executed by appointees in the White House and federal bureaucracy. And third, in order to justify such policy action, presidents often turn to electoral mandates and public opinion to support policy objectives. These mandates and public opinion may not always be clear, but presidents aiming to make bold policy rely on bold claims about how their policy actions align with the views of the American people.